This story happened to a young man named Jusu. After graduating 12th grade, he passed the entrance exam to a university in the city. Living in an unfamiliar place was extremely difficult, but it only took Jusu a few days to settle in. He even made friends with 2 boys in his dorm and was about to have his first college trip. The trip's location was not far away. In fact, it was just a hill next to the school. As planned, they would camp overnight on the hill. The air on the hill was really fresh. Although the hike up the hill was a bit rough, no one felt tired. However, things were not going smoothly. After walking for a while, they started to get lost. Eventually, they found a small path covered with trees. It looked very murky and mysterious. At the end of the small path lay a cold and lonely grave in the woods. Jusu was basically a child without fear. Seeing that, he invited 2 of his friends to come for a closer look. At first glance, it definitely looked like a tomb, but the shape of the tomb was really strange. The other 2 boys only stood there for a few minutes, then left. But Jusu still lingered, standing there, staring at the tomb. But strangely enough, the more he looked, the more he felt some kind of magical energy. This energy completely engrossed him. Then, his friend came over, shook his shoulder and called his name, loudly. Jusu suddenly woke up, but Jusu's face was still pale, and his limbs soft. He was sweating like a waterfall. Not only Jusu's face, but also his friends' faces had deteriorated, as if they had just seen something terrifying. The picnic must stop. But from that day on, strange things kept happening to dorm room 310. The first thing that happened was with Jusu's slippers. He has a habit of neatly arranging his slippers under the bed when he sleeps. But since that night, he was waking up to his slippers dispersed all around his room. Days later, the slippers were still being rearranged all over his dorm. So Jusu decided to talk to his roommates. But their expressions were very strange. One afternoon, Jusu suddenly saw all his roommates packing up, as if they wanted to leave. He thought they must be angry about the trivial matter a few days before, and that they decided to move. But looking at their facial expressions, Jusu could tell it was for other reasons. Then, someone new moved in, and his old roommates left overnight. But Jusu stayed because he really didn't believe in ghost stories. Until one night. On a normal evening, while reading a book, Jusu fell asleep and was woken up by the dorm's bell. But he just closed his eyes, ignoring it. 5 hours passed, and it was dinner time. At dinner, the dorm manager didn't see him come down. She was afraid that something was wrong. She ran upstairs to call him. Not believing his eyes, he looked at his watch again. But it was still 5 o'clock. His watch had stopped working. Even though he panicked a little, Jusu tried to reassure himself that he had just fallen asleep while reading the book. After dinner, Jusu decided to finish reading the book before going to bed. But with only a few lines, he could barely hold his eyes open. His body really couldn't resist sleep. Then he put the book aside, turned off the light, and went to bed. Suddenly, he woke up at 4 a.m. in a panic, as if he had just had a nightmare. Not only that, he had also found himself wearing proper clothes. But from what he remembers, he wore an old t-shirt to bed yesterday. His feet even wore shoes, and the shoes were covered with dirt and mud, as if he had been walking around for a long time. The shoes made his bed muddy. But Jusu really couldn't remember where he went yesterday. He just remembered turning off the lights and going to bed. On the sole of his muddy shoes, there was still fresh grass, so he could tell that he definitely went outside. In order to clarify what happened to him, Jusu decided to find his best friend Ken, who lived in the same dorm before. After school, Jusu secretly followed Ken to the garage. Looking around, seeing no one, Jusu immediately approached his best friend. Then, he suddenly grabbed his neck and pulled him into a hidden corner in the garage. As soon as he saw Jusu, Ken panicked, as if seeing a ghost. Blood drained from his face. After being released by Jusu and knowing the reason for his actions, Ken was able to calm down, but his hands and feet were still shaking. Of course, Ken firmly refused to answer Jusu's questions, only asking him to let go. Seeing that, Jusu began to soften his voice, saying that he really wanted to know what happened after they returned from their picnic. Seeing Jusu's facial expression, Ken started to feel pity. He lowered his face and thought for a long time. Observing Ken's body language, Jusu could tell that something bad had happened to him. Ever since coming to the city, he considered Ken his best friend, but now, when he was in trouble, the only thing Ken was doing was avoiding him. Immediately his anger erupted. Jusu could no longer keep calm. He grabbed Ken by the collar. Facing Jusu's anger, Ken gave in and finally accepted to speak the truth. It turned out that the strange things started happening after Jusu stood in front of the grave on the school trip. Ken told Jusu that he looked like he was possessed by a ghost. His eyes rolled back and his whole face was pale and mouth grinning wide. He told him that he also started waving his hands and feet and was singing like a crazy man. Ken went on to say that after that day, when the clock hit 12 o'clock, he got out of bed and would sleepwalk around the dorm. Ken said that every night was like that, and that Jusu kept pacing back and forth in the bathroom. He said that he kept banging his head against the wall and his mouth muttering something terrifying. Seeing Jusu's unusual behavior, Ken said that all the friends in the dorm were sure he was haunted, and then everyone chose to leave for peace. Hearing this, Jusu couldn't control his emotions, giving Ken a strong fist to the face. After that, he left Ken sitting on the ground. Jusu then called his father to tell him everything and got scolded by him. It seemed he knew how scary the tomb was. His face blacked out, and with a cold voice, he began to talk about the unknown tomb. 2 days later, after receiving the call, the father immediately set off and went to the dormitory where his son was staying. As soon as he arrived, Jusu's father asked to take him to the unknown tomb. Jusu also didn't say anything more. He immediately led his father to the hill next to the school. Jusu's father looked at the anonymous tomb for a long time. His face looked very serious. Then, he sat on the ground and opened the wooden chest he had brought along. It turned out that inside was copper brass. Then, he used this copper brass to burn pieces of votive paper. Soon after, Jusu's father stood up. His mouth began to murmur, as if he was reciting a spell. Strangely, as soon as his words ended, the copper brass trembled in a frightening way. Then, the fire in the brass was burning louder and louder, like someone added oil to it. At that same time, the father's face became more serious. It seemed that their request made the soul angry. In that moment, Jusu was clearly terrified, thinking that he could be haunted for the rest of his life. The father was also a bit panicked, but still tried to stay calm to reassure him. He put his hand on Jusu's shoulder saying that he would try to ask again. This time, Jusu's father prayed more sincerely. He bent down, clasped his hands respectfully. When the father finished his plead, the fire in the brass immediately shrank. It seemed that the spirit had accepted his appeal. No hurry to leave, after finishing everything, Jusu and his father still lingered to burn the remaining holy paper. Then, they tidied up the ashes, cleaned the tomb, and left. Perhaps Jusu would never forget the horror that happened to him on this strange grave. Afterwards, he also realized how much his father worried about him. Although his face was always calm, his shirt was already drenched in sweat on his back. He also realized that his father's profession was not as bad as he always thought it to be. Although he did not show it much, he really loved his son, so much. A few days later, Jusu's life began to settle down again. Perhaps this is why our grandparents often told us not to stare at the grave of the deceased.